we talk about the psychological mechanisms that truly break down a narcissist, we have to start at the root, the emotional supply that sustains them. This is often called narcissistic supply, and it's not just a term of pop psychology. It refers to something deeply embedded in the narcissist's personality structure. A narcissist's sense of self, you see, is not stable or intrinsic. It's a house of mirrors built entirely from the reflections of others, the praise, the admiration, the attention, even the negative reactions they provoke. Without that, they start to implode. So the first move, the first psychological lever, is to withdraw emotional supply, and to do so without warning. And this is not the same as ignoring someone out of spite or playing games. It is a conscious, disciplined act of self-possession. You stop feeding the system. You stop providing the reactions they crave, whether positive or negative. Because here's the paradox. To the narcissist, your outrage, your arguments, your emotional pleas are just as nourishing as your approval. It's not the content of the reaction that matters to them. It's the fact that you are reacting. You are confirming their importance, their centrality. When you withdraw that, when you disengage, not just physically, but emotionally, you cut off the fuel supply to the fragile engine of their ego. But here's where it gets psychologically interesting. The narcissist doesn't interpret this as a calm boundary or mature decision. They experience it as a threat to their very existence. Why? Because they don't have a well-developed internal world. They are, in many ways, empty inside. They rely on you to provide the cues and signals that tell them who they are. Remove those, and you're not just inconveniencing them, you're forcing them to confront the void. This is why people who have been in long-term relationships with narcissists often describe an uncanny moment when they step back emotionally, a moment when they stop arguing, stop explaining, stop reacting, and they watch the narcissist begin to spiral. Not because they've been insulted or criticized, but because they're no longer being fed. It's a kind of ego starvation. And what's fascinating is that the narcissist will often lash out at this more viciously than at any insult you could deliver. Because insults can be argued with, resisted or reframed. Silence, detachment, that can't be fought. It is absence itself that unnerves them. Now, to do this effectively, you need clarity of purpose. You have to understand that withdrawing emotional supply is not about punishing them or teaching them a lesson. It's about refusing to play the game at all. And that takes a certain philosophical maturity, because the temptation to jump back in, to argue, to explain yourself, to defend your position can be overwhelming. But every time you re-engage, you're re-entering the dynamic on their terms. You're giving them exactly what they want, proof that they still matter, proof that they still have power over you. So what does this look like in practice? It means holding your ground when they provoke. It means no longer giving them the emotional highs and lows they crave. It means understanding at a deep psychological level that your detachment is not coldness, it is strength. And that strength is precisely what begins to fracture the narcissist illusion of control. We can take this even further, philosophically speaking. There's a profound existential dimension here, because the narcissist's entire life strategy is a flight from the reality of their own vulnerability. By withdrawing emotional supply, you are, in effect, forcing them to confront that vulnerability. You are no longer participating in the grand performance. You are no longer holding up the scaffolding of their false self. And while they may rage or plead or manipulate to pull you back in, the real battle is internal. It's the confrontation they must have with themselves, one they have spent a lifetime avoiding. It's worth noting that this withdrawal does not guarantee immediate results. Sometimes it triggers a temporary escalation, a last-ditch effort to pull you back into the web. But if you can hold the line, something remarkable happens. The narcissist begins to lose their grip, not just over you, but over the very story they've been telling themselves about who they are. And here's the real takeaway. You do not defeat a narcissist by out-arguing them or exposing them in public or getting the last word. You defeat them by ceasing to be a character in their play. You reclaim your agency. You refuse to be a prop in their psychological theater. And in doing so, you leave them face to face with the one thing they fear most, the realization that without others to reflect back their image, they have no stable identity of their own. In the end, the most powerful move is not confrontation, it is transcendence. To step beyond the narcissist's reach is to remind both them and yourself that their power was never inherent, it was always borrowed from your attention. And once you reclaim that, they are left not just powerless, but profoundly alone. That, I would argue, is the first and perhaps most decisive psychological move that breaks them down. Let that truth settle in. It reminds you that sometimes the most radical act of strength is simply to walk away quietly without fanfare and let the silence do the work. If the first psychological move is about withdrawing emotional supply, the second is about mastering the art of boundary setting. Not just the casual, surface level kind, but the deep, principled kind that reshapes the power dynamic entirely. And this isn't as simple as telling someone, hey, don't talk to me that way, or please respect my space. No, true boundary setting goes to the core of who you are. It's an assertion of your sovereignty, your right to define where you end and where the other begins. Now, why is this so devastating to a narcissist? Because boundaries expose their fundamental weakness, their inability to respect the autonomy of others. Narcissists are, at their heart, boundary violators. They cross emotional, psychological, and sometimes even physical lines, not necessarily because they're plotting or malicious, but because they cannot tolerate the idea that someone else exists as a separate, independent being who does not revolve around their needs. When you set firm, non-negotiable boundaries, you are sending a signal they find intolerable. You are telling them, I exist apart from you. I have the right to say no. I will not bend simply because you want me to. And to the narcissist, that feels like a rejection of their very essence. It's not just defiance, it's a revelation of their lack of control. But here's where the psychological depth comes in. Setting boundaries effectively isn't about aggression. It's not about shouting or demanding or retaliating. It's about calm, firm clarity. The narcissist thrives on emotional chaos. If you set a boundary with anger, they will pull you back into the drama. If you set a boundary with guilt, they will manipulate you. But if you set a boundary with composed conviction, you become something they cannot easily destabilize. Philosophically, this is tied to the idea of logos, the capacity to embody truth in your speech and actions. When you speak from a place of deep personal alignment, you're not just asserting rules, you're embodying principles. You are standing on moral ground that is not easily shaken. And the narcissist, who lives largely in the realm of manipulation and performance, can't penetrate that. Consider how rare true boundaries are in modern relationships. Many people confuse compliance with kindness or avoidance with peace. But real boundaries are neither compliant nor avoidant. They are courageous. They require you to tolerate discomfort, your own and the narcissist's. Because make no mistake, when you first set firm boundaries, you will meet resistance. The narcissist will escalate, test, push, and provoke. They will try to make you doubt yourself to erode your resolve. And this is where your psychological preparation matters. You have to understand that their pushback is not evidence you are wrong, it's evidence you are doing something powerful. You are shifting the dynamic from one of enmeshment to one of individuation. And individuation, becoming a distinct whole person, is something the narcissist fears, because it means they can no longer use you as an extension of themselves. There's also a deeper ethical layer to this. By setting boundaries, you are not just protecting yourself, you are calling the narcissist to account. You are saying, in effect, I will no longer enable your distortions. I will no longer participate in this dynamic. And while they may never consciously acknowledge it, you are forcing them to confront their own behavior. You are presenting them with a mirror they would rather avoid. This is not to say you can change them, that's a separate issue entirely, but you can stop reinforcing their patterns. And in doing so, you reclaim not just your time or your energy, but your sense of integrity. It's worth noting that boundaries are not rigid walls. They are flexible, living expressions of your values and needs, but they require maintenance. You can't set a boundary once and expect the narcissist to respect it forever. You will have to hold the line repeatedly, consistently, often in the face of tremendous pressure. That is why boundary setting is ultimately an act of endurance, not just a momentary assertion. Not just a narcissist. To honor your own worth. You are rewiring your own patterns, moving from a posture of appeasement or self-doubt to one of self-respect. And that, paradoxically, is where the real power lies. Because when you no longer fear their reactions, when you no longer need their approval, you become free in a way they cannot touch. So if the first move was withdrawal of emotional supply, the second is the establishment of unshakable boundaries. Together, they form the backbone of your psychological strategy. You starve the narcissist of fuel, and you fortify yourself against invasion. And in doing so, you break the cycle of control. Let me leave you with this. The narcissist cannot shatter boundaries that are held from within. They may rage, they may scheme, they may plead, but if you stand firm, if you speak your truth calmly and consistently, you become something they cannot conquer. And that, in the end, is what turns the game on its head. You are no longer playing by their rules. You are living by your own. If we've talked about withdrawing emotional supply and establishing boundaries, the next move, and perhaps the most psychologically subtle, is refusing to engage in the narcissist's power games. Now, this might sound obvious at first, but I assure you it's not. In fact, it's where most people fall into the trap without even realizing. Narcissists thrive on provoking emotional reactions. It's not necessarily that they consciously plot every interaction like a chess master, but at a deep psychological level, they are wired to hook you into their drama. They push your buttons, they escalate conflicts, they twist narratives, all to keep you reactive. And why? Because when you are reactive, you're controllable. You've handed over your center of gravity to them. What most people don't understand is that the narcissist's real addiction isn't attention or praise per se. It's control over your emotional state. If they can make you angry, or guilty, or desperate, or confused, they win. Not because they beat you in the conventional sense, but because they've kept you dancing to their rhythm. Now, how do you break that? How do you step out of the cycle? You break it by developing what psychologists call strategic indifference. That doesn't mean you become cold or cruel. It means you stop feeding their need to manipulate you emotionally. You stop rewarding the bait. Let's take a simple example. A narcissist might make a cutting remark, something subtle, a backhanded compliment, a small humiliation in public, an accusation laced with just enough truth to hurt. What they're doing here is throwing a line into the water, waiting for you to bite, and most people do. They defend themselves, they attack back, they explain, they plead. All of these reactions, though understandable, are hooks. You've been drawn into the frame they control. But imagine instead that you refuse to bite. You acknowledge the remark, perhaps even with a faint smile, but you do not engage emotionally. You neither rise to the bait nor fall into self-doubt. You hold your ground in quiet, confident detachment. That, right there, is power. Philosophically, this ties into the idea of mastering the self before attempting to master the situation. It's not about winning in the external sense. It's about no longer being ruled by your opponent's provocations. And this is profoundly difficult because it requires you to confront your own vulnerabilities. The narcissist can only hook you where you are still uncertain, where you are still seeking approval, where you are still afraid to stand alone. So refusing to engage is not passive, it's active discipline. It's a conscious, repeated choice to stay anchored in your own sense of self, no matter how skillfully they try to pull you off balance. And it's not just about controlling your outward behavior, it's about mastering the internal landscape, recognizing the familiar poles of anger, fear, or validation seeking, and choosing not to be ruled by them. One of the most fascinating aspects of this is how quickly the narcissist starts to unravel when you hold this line. You see, they're not used to people who won't play. They're used to triggering reactions and then feeding off the emotional fallout. When you deny them that, when you stay steady, unhooked, they often escalate, trying harder and harder to provoke you. But this escalation isn't a sign that you're failing, it's a sign that you're succeeding. You're forcing them into territory they're not equipped to handle, a dynamic they don't control. At a deeper level, this refusal to engage isn't just about protecting yourself. It's about exposing the emptiness of their strategies. When their provocations stop working, when their manipulations no longer generate the desired chaos, they're left facing a void they can't easily fill. You, in a sense, are holding up a mirror, reflecting back the reality that they are not as powerful as they believe. This is why it's so important to understand that power in these situations is not loud, it's quiet, it's calm, it's steady. It's the kind of power that doesn't need to shout because it isn't trying to convince anyone. So, to sum it up, the fourth power move is not about aggression or confrontation. It's about clarity. It's about calmly reflecting the truth of the moment without distortion, without apology. It's about refusing to let their manipulations shape the shared reality and instead standing firmly in your own. And the closing point I want to leave you with is this. When you calmly reflect a narcissist's behavior, you expose not just their weaknesses, but your own emerging strength. You show, through your steadiness, that you are no longer dependent on their approval, no longer tangled in their illusions. You become, in a very real sense, untouchable. Not because they've changed, but because